She stood at the edge of the dirt road with nothing but a weathered suitcase in her hand and silence in her throat. The sky above stretched gray and endless, mirroring the stairs that had greeted her upon arrival. Her dress, once chosen with hope, now clung to her like a memory of what this trip was supposed to be. But it wasn't her clothes or her posture that made them recoil. It was her skin. That was all they saw. And so they turned her away, coldly, without shame. No welcome, no warmth. Just muttered slurs behind swinging doors and the harsh certainty that she didn't belong. But someone else was watching. A man who didn't move when the others laughed. A man holding an axe, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of the life he'd built with his own hands. He didn't flinch, because he saw something different. She thought her journey ended in humiliation. She didn't know it was only just beginning with the one man no one expected. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and stay for this powerful tale of love, race, and the courage to choose dignity over tradition. The town was small, barely a name on the map, nestled between tall pine forests and fields that stretched for miles. Wooden cabins stood like stubborn survivors along a single dirt road, and the people were much the same, rooted in old ways, cautious of outsiders, and quick to pass judgment with their eyes. It was into this place that Ruth Bennett arrived, a black woman in her early 20s, carrying all she owned in a single brown suitcase. She had traveled from the deep South, answering a mail-order bride advertisement with trembling hope. Educated, poised, and quietly fierce, Ruth wasn't naive. She knew the risks. But she also knew that staying where she was meant more than poverty. It meant danger. So she came north, seeking not just a husband, but a life where she could be more than a shadow in someone else's world. The Garrison brothers, tall and smug in their pressed shirts and work boots, were the ones who had posted the ad. They had expected beauty, but not her kind. When Ruth stepped off the wagon and introduced herself, they stared at her like a bad joke. "We wanted a wife," one said, chuckling, "not trouble." The other snorted, refusing to even take her bag. The humiliation was swift, public, and cruel. Ruth didn't cry. She stood her ground, chin high, suitcase still in hand, dignity intact. Across the path, not far from the cabins, stood Clayton Ward. Mid-30s, rugged and broad-shouldered, his plaid shirt rolled to the elbows and an axe hanging loosely in his grip. His farm was the largest in the region, land he had carved out himself over a decade of grueling work. Once the son of a sharecropper, Clayton had built everything with his hands, and though he rarely spoke more than needed, his silence held meaning. He watched the scene unfold from the edge of the clearing, his gaze unmoving, not on Ruth, but on the brothers. There was no amusement in his expression, just judgment. The axe in his hand wasn't raised, but it might as well have been a mirror, reflecting back the hollowness of men who thought cruelty was strength. Ruth didn't see Clayton watching. Not yet. But in that moment, as she stood in a place that clearly didn't want her, she had no idea that her presence had already begun to shift something buried deep beneath the soil, and that a man whose own heart had once closed itself off was already taking the first quiet step toward opening it again. Ruth's boots hit the dusty road after days of bone-rattling travel, her body tired, but her spirit intact. She had worn her best dress, the only one not faded from years of scrubbing, and carried the weight of her future in a scuffed leather suitcase. As she approached the Garrison property, the two brothers stepped out of their cabin with smirks already curling at their lips. They looked her up and down, their amusement cruel and immediate. "You must be lost," one of them said, spitting into the dirt. The other let out a low chuckle. We wanted a bride, not a problem. Ruth didn't flinch. She reached into her bag and produced the letter, the ad they'd written themselves. "You sent for me," she said calmly. "You wrote this." But they only laughed louder. "We didn't expect—" The older one gestured vaguely at her. "You think we'd let you into our home. You're lucky we didn't call the sheriff." Her face remained composed, but her hands tightened around the handle of her suitcase. "I didn't come here to be your pet," she said evenly. "I came to be someone's partner." That silenced them for a moment, but only long enough for their pride to sting. Then, without another word, they turned their backs and walked away, muttering under their breath about how these people never learn. The screen door slammed behind them, and just like that, Ruth was left alone, in a place where she was invited until she arrived. She didn't sit. She didn't beg. She stood by the edge of the road with her suitcase beside her, her chin lifted, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Pride had been her burden all her life, and her protection. Returning south meant crawling back into the same danger she had risked everything to escape. Staying meant humiliation. But she stayed, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because dignity demanded she not let these men define her worth. And then, through the silence, came the soft crunch of boots on gravel. She turned slightly, her jaw set. Clayton Ward stood a few feet away, his axe now hanging loosely at his side. He didn't speak. His gaze was steady, unreadable. Then, without a word, he stepped forward, bent down, and picked up the second bag she had dropped earlier, the one that held her Bible, her letters, and the last photograph of her mother. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer pity. He simply nodded his head once toward the wooded path that led to his land. His gesture was simple, but it spoke more than any promise ever could. Ruth stared at him, searching for mockery in his face, but there was none. Just calm, quiet invitation. And as the Garrison brothers watched from behind their curtains, uncertain now of what they had triggered, Ruth took her first step. Not toward a stranger, but toward a future they never imagined she deserved. Clayton didn't offer explanations. He simply led Ruth down the long dirt path to his cabin, a modest wooden home nestled at the edge of the pine line, where the fields stretched far and the wind moved slowly. He opened the door for her, set her bags gently inside, and said only, "You can stay as long as you need. No strings." And with that, he returned to his daily work, leaving the silence between them unforced and respectful. Ruth didn't ask for more. Instead, she rose each morning before the sun and worked the land with him. They tilled soil, watered rows, fed livestock. Clayton handed her gloves and tools, never once treating her like she couldn't match his pace. And Ruth didn't try to impress him. She simply showed up, strong and quiet, day after day. What began as mutual silence turned into a rhythm, a shared understanding built not on words, but on motion. They drank coffee together on the porch in the mornings, the steam curling like breath between them. Sometimes he'd hand her the mug first, rough hands brushing hers for a moment too long. Other times, they'd say nothing at all, but the stillness was comfortable. He never asked about her past. She never asked about his loss. But she could see it in his eyes, that grief had shaped him too. One evening, as the sky bruised with sunset, Clayton handed her the axe. "Go ahead," he said. She looked at him, surprised. He nodded. "We're building a fence tomorrow. You should know how to do it right." And as she raised the axe and struck the wood, he stood beside her, not correcting, not hovering, just watching. It was the first time she realized the axe no longer stood between them. It was now something shared. Power passed, not possessed. A few in town began to whisper. They'd see Ruth in the market, chin high, hands calloused, speaking plainly with merchants. They whispered about how she hadn't left, about how Clayton let her stay. Some said he'd lost his mind. Others said worse. But neither of them flinched. Clayton never defended her. He didn't have to. His presence beside her was defense enough. Then came the county harvest gathering, a yearly event where landowners and workers came together, and where appearances were everything. Ruth was hesitant to go, but Clayton insisted. "They'll see what I see," he said. "And if they don't, let 'em stare." They walked in together, and heads turned. Ruth wore a simple blue dress, her curls pinned neatly, her face proud. Clayton stood tall beside her, nodding at those who dared meet his gaze. Midway through the evening, as laughter and fiddles filled the barn, Clayton clinked a spoon to his glass and stood up. "This here," he said, nodding to Ruth, "is Ruth Ward." "My wife." The room fell silent. Ruth froze for a breath, but then turned to face him fully, something warm and steady blooming behind her ribs. After dinner, at the long wooden table where the neighbors sat passing pie and suspicion, Clayton unfolded a letter from his coat pocket. In his calm, gravel voice, he read aloud, "By this notice, the undersigned certifies full acquisition of the garrison land, house, and all holdings, transferred in full to C. Ward as of last week." He looked around the table. "Bought it." Every acre. He folded the letter again, slowly, and looked across the room, not at the crowd, but at Ruth. "Some land," he said, "was never worth the men who worked it. But that doesn't mean it can't be reclaimed." And in that moment, the room didn't know what to do. But Ruth did. She stood, placed her hand gently on Clayton's arm, and smiled, not for them, but for herself. The fire they'd tried to burn her in had only made her stronger. And now she stood on land that once rejected her, claimed not by force, but by dignity. The morning after the harvest gathering, the cabin was quiet, bathed in the soft gold of early light. Ruth sat at the kitchen table, fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup, still processing everything Clayton had said the night before. She had never imagined she'd be called someone's wife. Certainly not like that, in front of those who once looked through her like she was invisible. Clayton entered, wiping the dirt from his hands, and sat across from her. He watched her for a long moment, then reached into his coat pocket once more, and pulled out the folded newspaper ad, the very one that had brought her here. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice steady. "That ad, it wasn't just to find a wife." Ruth tilted her head slightly, waiting. "I used to work for the Garrison brothers," he admitted, "before I owned a single acre. They treated me like a mutt they'd picked up off the road, paid me in scraps, mocked my ideas, said I'd never have land of my own." He paused, eyes distant. "I left with nothing but a shovel and a broken back. Spent 10 years building what they laughed at." He unfolded the ad slowly. "When I saw them posting for a bride, I had a thought. What if the woman who showed up wasn't what they expected? What would they do?" His eyes met hers. "I didn't place that ad to find someone to cook or clean. I wanted to know if they were still the same men. And I wanted to know if someone out there could face that kind of rejection and still walk forward." Ruth blinked slowly, her breath catching as the pieces clicked together. "You were testing them," she whispered. Clayton nodded. "And I was waiting for someone strong enough to stand in that fire and not crumble. I didn't want a perfect woman. I wanted one who knew what it meant to be rejected and still love anyway. You're her." he stood, walked to the hearth, and, without ceremony, tossed the crumpled ad into the flames. It caught quickly, curling into ash as if it had never existed. Later that day, Ruth climbed a short ladder and nailed a wooden sign above the front door. In careful, bold letters, she had painted her name, R. Ward. No title, no need for one, just a name claimed, a space made her own. There was no celebration, no announcement, just the two of them walking the land as the sun dipped low, casting their shadows side by side over the rows they'd planted. Ruth didn't gloat. She didn't look back toward the town or the men who had scorned her. She looked forward, toward the trees, the hills, the home she'd made not by being chosen, but by choosing herself first. And beside her walked a man who hadn't saved her, but who had made space for her to stand tall, all on her own. Word traveled slowly in the town, as it always did, carried on the backs of whispered opinions and side glances. Some folks still crossed the street when Ruth walked by. Some pretended not to see her at all, but others, those who mattered, began to step forward. The town's school teacher, a middle-aged widow named Mrs. Talbot, stopped Ruth one afternoon just to press a hand to her shoulder and say, "About time someone like you showed them what real grace looks like." The banker nodded respectfully the next time she and Clayton came in together. A group of widows invited Ruth to afternoon tea, where they quietly admitted they'd never had the courage to do what she did. Instead of shrinking into the shadows of a town that once denied her, Ruth began to build. Not for herself alone, but for those who would come after. She started a literacy circle on Sunday afternoons, gathering young black girls and overlooked farm wives in the shade of the barn. With donated books and unmatched chairs, she taught them to read, to write, to speak. And Clayton, watching her from the porch as she lit fire after fire with her words, donated a portion of his land to build a proper school. Knowledge, he said simply, shouldn't be a privilege. The soil that had once swallowed her pride now answered to her touch. Where she was once turned away for her skin, she now turned soil into freedom. On the morning of their first anniversary, Ruth stood before the cabin that had grown with them. New porch, fresh paint, stronger beams. She held a letter in her hands, edges worn from being opened and reread. It was from her younger sister, who wrote, "I'm coming, not because I'm afraid, but because I want to become like you." Ruth wiped a quiet tear from the edge of her cheek and smiled as Clayton walked up behind her. He didn't ask what the letter said. He just wrapped an arm around her shoulder, and together they watched the mist lift from their land. Later that week, they rode into town side by side, horses slow and steady. This time, heads turned not with scorn, but with silent respect. Children waved. The grocer tipped his hat, and the preacher nodded as they passed. Ruth met each glance calmly. She no longer needed to be accepted. She had grown roots in a place that once spat her out, and those roots were deep, unshakable. This wasn't just the story of a bride. It wasn't about being chosen or bought. It was about breaking soil where no one believed anything could grow, and finding love among the roots. Not the kind wrapped in ribbons or written in ads, but the kind earned in silence, in labor, in patience. The kind that didn't flinch in the face of hate. The kind that turned a cabin into a home and a rejection into a revolution. Sometimes love doesn't arrive in a letter. It's built with hands that heal what hate once touched. Ruth didn't come looking for a fairy tale. She came searching for a future, even if the road led through rejection, silence, and stares. But what she found was something far deeper. A man who didn't speak over her, but stood beside her. A life not gifted, but built. slowly, with patience, with shared soil and steady steps. And in a place where she was once turned away for her skin, she planted something lasting. Have you ever stood alone for what was right, only to find someone silently standing beside you? If this story stirred something in you, share it with someone who still believes dignity can rewrite history. Someone who knows that love, when grounded in respect, can break barriers no law or tradition ever could. Follow us for more powerful stories where love defies boundaries and silence speaks louder than words. Thank you for watching. See you next time, where courage meets compassion and love grows where it was once forbidden.